ready to rock.
Sure.
So if nothing else, this will become a good recorded video presentation as well. So everyone will have access to this. But
True.
yeah. But now that we're rocking and rolling, Natalie, I'm just going to let you take it over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And thanks for your patience on this. It's fun. Technology gods weren't playing fair today. And thank you for staying up so late as well. It's pretty early here in Melbourne, so I'm not sitting around at night. But hopefully we're going to get a lot of value out of this next session. And I'm going to tell you all about how to attract and convert top-notch sponsors to your podcast. And guys, I've left quite a bit of time for Q&A as well, because I think that's probably the most valuable part. So a quick background on me, in case you've never heard of me. I was watching the chat there, and a few people were like, does Natalie have a podcast? So yes, I do. I started the Suitcase Entrepreneur podcast actually in late 2011, and at the time I was doing it once a month, pretty regularly, but not always, and I just started going twice weekly last week. So I have around 128 episodes published now, which is fantastic. Approaching 500,000 downloads, which I'm really proud of, especially because I didn't put a lot of effort in at the beginning. Approached my first sponsor from Dubai Airport after a moment of inspiration. So I'll talk to you about that and how you can get sponsors. And I've been getting sponsors ever since, and generally on my own terms, which is a really cool thing, because I know that a lot of people get sort of bogged down in sponsorship bureaucracy sometimes, or they take on people just because they want some money in the door. So I hope that that's not something that you guys are going to have to do. So, quick question here, how do you attract a sponsor? I actually just think that you need to know why you want one in the first place. I don't think sponsorship is right for everybody, and I know myself listening to podcasts, I hate it when the sponsor reel goes on for way too long. I think it kind of takes away and detracts from the content of the podcast. But when it's done right, it should be a pretty natural thing, and something that is actually valuable to your audience and readers and listeners as well. I just think you've got to be bold and approach them. A lot of people are like, oh, I'd really love, Nike, for example, which might not be the best example in the world, but they don't even ever ask or get an in with the marketing manager there or somebody in the local division of Nike. There's always a way in if the sponsor is right for your business and your brand. It's all about alignment in their eyes. And if you have a great story and you tell them your why you do what you do and how that fits in with them, you just never know who you can attract as sponsors, even when you're just starting out. And the final thing that I would say is don't take the first no for an answer. That pretty much applies to everything you do in life. But often, big companies are busy, or smaller companies that you want to get in touch with, the email might go to the wrong person, it might have got stuck in their spam filter. So I would hit them up on Twitter, I would hit them up through their website contact form, I would go through LinkedIn to see who the key people are in that business who are going to help you get into the sponsorship or get in front of the person who deals with the budget for sponsorships. And I would just keep trying, especially if you really want them on your show and especially if you think they're a great fit. So those are just some of my top tips that I've used over the years to get sponsors. Sponsors that I've had to date have been pretty cool. So I had Scross, which is a Swiss firm, and they do travel adapters, so perfectly aligned with what I do at the Suitcase Entrepreneur. They were the first people that I ever contacted. I was sitting, as I said, in Dubai Airport, and I just bought one because I really needed one. And I was like, this is an amazing, really cool adapter. And I was like, I'd really like to shout out about them more. So I actually went to their website, looked up the marketing manager on their website, and sent them an email and said, look, I'd love to work with you guys. I have a podcast. I think I could get the word out about you. I travel all the time. It seems like a really good fit, and I could do it from a really natural way. And they agreed. They'd never sponsored an individual before in their life. They generally do advertising through major firms or through Google AdWords or in their own way. So this was a big risk for them, and it was really great. And the cool thing about it is the longevity of those podcasts still exists today. So they're still getting leads, and they actually want to work with me again after all these years, which is a good thing. I had audiobooks come on board, Regis, which is co-working spaces around the world, once again really aligned with what I do at the Suitcase Entrepreneur. I had Namecheap, who are my sort of domain name providers that I've always used. Odesk were on there, and that was great because they're all about lifestyle and entrepreneurship and the new way of working. This was a really beautiful fit. 99 Designs, and just recently picked up HostGator. So you can see how all these firms are pretty big firms actually as well, and also align with what I talk about in my community around freedom in business and adventure in life. So really, really good fit in sponsors, and I've been lucky to work with them, and they've just been really supportive and proactive. So this is where I want you to ask, who's your ideal sponsor? Because as I said at the very beginning, I think a lot of people, when you're starting out with a podcast, you kind of go after anybody and everybody. It would just be fun to have some dollars coming in to cover some of your setup costs for your podcast. But I think you really need to think about alignment and a great fit. So they need to get what you're about in the first place. I've had some really odd sponsors come to me that just I wouldn't even have the goal to talk about on my podcast or be able to talk about from an authentic point of view. They're just not a right fit at all, and nothing related to lifestyle, entrepreneurship, co-working, travel, etc. So they need to get what you're about. They don't just want to be like throwing money at you for the sake of it, because your listeners are going to get put off, and they're more important than any sponsor. They need to understand your audience's needs. So I think it's really important for you to know who your audience is, the demographics, their desires, their needs, their challenges, and then of course select a company or a business that has a related product or service that really helps your listeners. So of all those ones that I showed you before, all of them were really pertinent to my audience. Most of my audience are around the world, and they're trying to set up online businesses and also travel, do it from their laptop, do it from their smartphone. So all of those services actually help them do that in some way or the other. And they have to have a real budget. I have been after sponsors before who actually look like they're doing really well, but from a marketing perspective, they have zero budget to play with, and that they actively invest in advertising or podcasts. So if you're listening to other people's podcasts and you hear, for example, 99 Designs have been sponsoring them, then you know that 99 Designs are using podcasts as a way of advertising. So sometimes that's a great way to like look at who other people are getting sponsored by, and then go and approach them as well and say, look, I know you're sponsoring these people, we have a similar audience, but it's a bigger reach, or maybe you've got some point of difference that you can attract them with. And the budget-wise side, it's really good to approach people around that time of the year when they have to actually spend their budget, which is often around November, or when they're setting their budget, which is often December, January, the new year. So if you can get in front of them and say, hey, here's why you need to sponsor us this year, they'll actually allocate budget for you. So it's good to hit them up when they have that moment of need to actually fill sponsorships. So how do you go about closing the deal? Interesting point. We've actually created a dedicated page on the Suitcase Entrepreneur podcast, but we didn't used to have that. But this is where I actually tell them a little bit more about when it was established. Oh, look, I'm lying there. It was actually established a bit earlier than that, but I guess May 2012 was when it really started ramping up for me. And then you can talk about downloads if you want. You can talk about any nominations you've had, and you can also talk about the types of guests you have on, the topics that you talk about. And below this, I just have some more information on what we expect from sponsors, the kind of win-win situations that we want, kind of relationships that we like to build. And I actually list some of the sponsors that we've had below that as well, just to show proof of credibility. And we introduced this little chart on the right to kind of say what's coming up and which slots are available. So each year we renew this. And it's just a good thing to be able to sort of show that you do have sponsors involved, that there is a little bit of a wait list, and that they can come on board for any of those preceding months in the year. So it's good to show that you look like you treat this as a business, and that sponsorship is something you take seriously for both sides. You also want to think about their what's in it for me. So I know a lot of people who approach big name sponsors and they don't even think about why would it be useful for that sponsor. So you always want to come at it from their point of view. What are they thinking about? Their audience reach, demographic they want to get in front of, how often you're going to be promoting them, in what type of way, how long the sponsor shout out is for. In addition to that sponsor shout out on your podcast, what else are you going to be doing for them? So always thinking about like how can you make it the best win-win situation for them and a long-term relationship. Because if you could get one sponsor on for half a year, you're set. Sell them on your audience, not the numbers. This is a big one, especially when you're starting out. I know some people who do it on a cost per conversion and the number of downloads, and they have a percentage or a payout per download. But when you're just starting out, you don't have those numbers. It's really hard to kind of make that look good. So I would suggest you sell them on your audience once again. So not only are they getting the podcasts and potentially the monthly reach, but they're also getting that for life, because podcast content sticks around for ages and people don't just start at the latest one. They often go back through all of your podcasts. So even once they've stopped being a sponsor, they're still getting that long-term benefit and return on investment. You also want to talk to them about your social media reach, your email list reach, the value of the connections that you have, and how responsive your audience are. So when you're small and starting out, you might have a very responsive audience that are very engaged and will likely actually take the sponsor offer up. So you can always get around that if you're not the biggest name out there. So lots of ways to sell your podcast. I definitely suggest that you have set packages. We don't really like sponsors to come on for less than 2 to 4 episodes, so we have this kind of starter package where you can come in and just try it out for 2 episodes. We can see what the click-through and the conversion's like. We can test whether it's a good fit, and then they can extend. But generally, we like people to come on for 1 or 2 months. And I actually don't want sponsors on for much longer than 2 months because I want to change things up and introduce other people. I think it gets a bit stale when you're just hearing the same sponsor all the time. And I like to introduce different services and products that I think my audience would really like. So you can play around with your packages that suit you, and then it also gives you a bit of lead time and a runway to introduce other sponsors and say, you know, something's coming up in May when we can actually have you on board, and it creates a little bit more urgency for them and a little bit more exclusivity for you. Think about your running costs. I mean, in general, podcasts don't cost that much depending on who you're hosting it on, but think about all that time that you may be doing the podcast notes, the editing. I mean, I outsource all that, but it's still, you know, a cost to me, and there's a lot of time involved for a lot of people. So think about what you'd like to be paid and what would be worth it for you and what would allow you to grow your podcast even more with that investment from sponsors. And then charge accordingly. So a lot of us, I think, will undersell, but some of the bigger name companies definitely have a big budget. And if you think about the reach and the engagement they're going to get, it's a far better spend of their dollar than them doing Facebook or Google advertising or some form of other sponsorship at an event. So if you can get an idea on those numbers, or if you can look at past data that you have with other sponsors that you might have closed, you can really sell them on that as well, and that's very attractive to those companies. That's actually all I really wanted to say on that, guys, because I really wanted to answer any specific questions that people might have related to their podcast, especially if they're starting out, and how to go about selecting sponsors and the kind of things that you can charge. So hopefully that's useful. And if you have to run because it's late, you can hit me up at suitcaseentrepreneur.com. My podcast is /live, and you can also chat to me on Twitter.
So, Natalie, okay, so I'll get started with a question. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So, you know, I've seen 2 different schools of thought when it comes to podcast advertising. I know you touched on it a little bit, but you can you've got the people that go with the large companies, and you see the Squarespaces and the things like that. And you know that seems like, I guess, the most attainable is what it seems like from the outside. But then, of course, you've got the more targeted sponsors, a lot of the ones you talked about that are more specific to your industry. What do you think is easier to get? Is it easier to go out there and convince people that are close to your industry of your podcast to sponsor it, or is it easy to go out to those people that sponsor lots of podcasts and get a hold of them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I prefer to have sponsors that aren't on as many other people's podcasts. I know 99 Designs are doing quite a big push, but I'd actually approached them well before they were on Smart Passive Income because I really like what they've done, and I've used them for quite a long time. So same with Odesk. Like, I'm a big fan of Odesk. I actually approach sponsors that I already use. I use their products or their services, and then I can talk from a much more kind of genuine way. Like, I'm naturally enthusiastic about them anyway. I talk about them on my podcast, and then it's kind of just like a natural conversion to say, hey, you really should be sponsoring this, because I get a lot of great feedback from people. So I would suggest, once again, come back to brands and companies that align with what you're doing and make sense. Because if you're talking about technology, ironically, even though we've had trouble with it today, and you attract a sponsor that does hair care products, it's just not even going to relate. So I would suggest you go for the quick wins that are the people that you're already using. And if you can show them that you've been using their product or service, it already shows a great relationship and synergy there for you.
So then it sounds like there needs to be some kind of groundwork almost ahead of time. So if you know you're going to approach this sponsor in a month or 2, maybe you start talking about them a little more organically and make it not seem so forced. But I mean, that to me, that sounds like an obvious thing. If you are, you know, especially you, maybe you do start talking about Odesk a little more leading up to it. So if they go back and listen to the last few episodes, they're like, oh, she already uses us, so it makes sense.
Absolutely, and I think Odesk is a great example. I'd included them in my Suitcase Entrepreneur book. I put them in another product. I'd written a blog post about them. I'd done a video including them, and so I could actually point to all those things when I approached them in the email, and it was just a really good fit. They were excited that I was already doing that, so they're like, all right, let's give it a shot.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat room from Charles Wood. He says, how do you sell on audience rather than numbers? And all the sponsors he's ever talked to have asked for numbers, and I've noticed that too. They don't even worry about, well, how engaged is your community, or those kind of things. It's all about the first question: how many downloads do you get?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's probably just the way in which I approach them. Like, if that's their top need right out of the gate, then I think they're not necessarily focusing on the right thing, which may sound strange to them, but honestly, it is for me about longevity, it's about relationship, and it's about my reach. I have a pretty significant social media reach now, and also via my email list, and those are all things that I offer as part of the sponsorship package. So when I had much smaller numbers that may not have appealed to them, and I did have a bit of pushback from sponsors, then I just say, yeah, but look at all these other things that you're getting. And that usually seemed to convince them, and that's the kind of point where you can say, look, just give us a go for 2 episodes or even 4 episodes, and let's test the numbers and see how this works out for you. And if they're still a bit hesitant, you can either come up with a better package or a trial offer, or you could do a split on sponsor amount and maybe an affiliate commission. So there are ways to work around that, but I think it's all in the way you tell your why and the story and the audience that you have. There are ways to do it. You just got to be convincing and really know who you're after.
So do you actually tell the sponsors, I will share your product or your service or information about you this many times per month on social media, or is the only guarantee that you give them the actual mentions on the podcast?
Yeah, I actually don't specify it completely, but on that page or when we send them the contract, we say you'll get this many shout outs across these episodes on these dates, and you'll also get mentions on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook page, and we put the amounts, like the amount of people in those communities there, plus at least a guaranteed email out in the newsletter, because we put out a podcast newsletter every week, and as a result, there is an email going out pointing them to the episode which has that sponsor in it. And sometimes we do dedicated shout-outs in that thing, like we're really like to welcome our new sponsor that just came on board. So I never guarantee the exact numbers, but I definitely tell them that they'll get that social media output and reach for the duration of the sponsorship.
Have you ever had a sponsor come to you and complain about lack of conversion, or maybe there was some kind of miscommunication and you had to figure out how to iron out those discrepancies and maybe figure out a win-win to keep them involved so they don't just fail altogether?
Yeah, I mean, 99 Designs, I think they just started working with Pat about a month after me or something, and I just obviously can't get as many conversions as Pat, and I think my audience potentially, even though they would use that service, it was a little bit more expensive for them, so maybe it wasn't the right fit. And we actually just upped the social media mentioning and that way, which definitely helped conversions. But at the end of that sponsorship, they didn't want to renew it. There were no hard feelings. They didn't want to renew. They said it was really good working with you. We really like that, but we need more of a conversion rate on this. So it wasn't that they backed down from their sponsorship, and it wasn't that we didn't do anything right. It just wasn't the perfect fit, or our audience reach wasn't enough, or they didn't like the product that much. So never had any bad results, but definitely it's good that sponsors feel they can be honest about that. And they are open to working with me again in the future, which is good. I just think we probably would need to work out a better conversion, have a better call to action for them.
Okay, so Joseph has a good question. He wants to know how many downloads you were at before you started reaching out to sponsors. And I guess the second part to that question that I would add is, once you did get those sponsors, did you notice a drop in downloads at all, maybe scaring some people away because you had sponsors?
Good question. I think the number of downloads that I had at the time was pretty minimal. I mean, I really only started ramping up about 6 or 9 months after I never hit the new and noteworthy. It wasn't one of those tactics that we knew about back then. So I would say probably only a few thousand a month, which is fine. For those of you who have a few thousand a month, that's still great, but wasn't a huge amount. I think because my first sponsor was one that had never sponsored anything like this before, it was probably a good alignment because they were new to it, so they weren't expecting much, and I was new to it, so I wasn't expecting that much. But once again, I really don't think it matters too much how many downloads you have if you can talk about that overall benefits package and the longevity of their sponsor outreach being on podcasts forevermore. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to start off with. And the second question, sorry.
Yeah, I was just asking, when you did actually incorporate sponsors into
right,
it,
yeah.
did you see an effect of your downloads or your audience?
I didn't, that I could noticeably see. No, in fact, it just kept growing. So I'm pretty protective about my audience and readership, and so I hope that I never sound like I'm just reading something. In fact, I never do. I actually write up my own content for it, and often I ad-lib and I talk about it from having used the service, which I think is way more natural. And I only give them one sponsor shout-out during it. So I definitely had somebody in a review of my iTunes going, what the heck, it was a promo for the first few minutes or something, which I thought was a little harsh, but maybe that's the way it came across. So I'm very observant now about how long I spend on it and just making it sound as natural as possible and that it relates to that and also that it supports the growth of the podcast. So I think people are used to it now. They're used to the fact that if you're putting out an independent podcast in your own cost and you're putting out this great free content, they at least need to listen out for the sponsor section because that's what's keeping you going and adding to it.
Okay, so one of the things, and you mentioned, you do it naturally, you read it in your own words, but I have heard stories of sponsors insisting that you read their liners as they provide them, whatever it is, as opposed to people reading it in their own voice and their own tone. Have you had any sponsors that just insisted on you reading it how they wrote it?
Absolutely not, and if that was what they did, I'd cancel the contract, quite honestly. Like, I just can't be bothered with that. If they want it to really come across natural and to engage with people, I would never read that. It also sounds really formalized. I mean, no offense, we have good friends in the podcasting community who do that, and it just makes me want to, like, just turn it off each time. So no. And for example, with HostGator that we've just brought on board for the next quarter, they actually just gave us bullet points of talking points that we can talk to, but they were more than happy for me to make it up and make it my own, which is perfect.
You read all of yours, I guess, in real time? You don't have any pre-recorded bumpers that are at the beginning of or the end?
I actually pre-record all my intros. So my interview or my episode is always done on that, and then I will actually, depending on who the sponsor is or what I want to talk about, I do the intro and outro about 4 or 5 days before it goes live, just in case anything's changed or something's come up and I want to mention about, for example, the 15-day blog challenge I have, just so I can put that in. So no, they're always recorded after the episode, actually.
And one question that came up yesterday when it comes to the sponsorships, and since you are recording them separately from the interview, some people were asking, I think it was Kate, and they were asking her about Entrepreneur on Fire, if they have some kind of rule or agreement, how many of the past episodes they have to leave those sponsorships on, if they could resell sponsorships for old episodes or anything like that. What's the typical arrangement that you have? Is it just kind of unspoken that once it's published it's going to stay that way? Or is there something else you can do with repurposed content?
I mean, that's not a bad idea, but I think I'd feel pretty bad, and quite honestly, I don't know if I want to go back and edit all of those. And plus, they pay for the sponsorship during that time. I feel they should have the longevity of that. It's kind of, as you said, it's the unspoken word that goes off there. So I think you could repurpose that content into shorter form podcasts or a different thing, and with that, arrange for new sponsorship. Absolutely. But if I was a sponsor and I went back to the episode that I knew we were on and suddenly didn't find myself there, I'd be pretty frustrated.
Right. Yeah. That's for sure. But I was wondering, in terms of agreements, if there was anything there, if it was just understood.
I think it's understood. Like, we do say that that's for that episode, and I would think that they think that's for the life of that episode and the podcast. So that's how I view it. Nobody's ever questioned me on it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Joseph has a question, and this kind of his specific question is: have you ever sold sponsorships to hotels? Considering you're all over the place, but I guess that also brings up the question, like these large brands like hotels, airlines, things like that. Are those kind of the big daddy? Is that like the big fish to land, or are those things that even you think would ever be a possibility?
It's a great call, Joseph. Like, Starwood Preferred Guest would probably be one that I'd go after because I do actually like the service and I use it and I have experience with it. But once again, it really comes back to me for, is this useful for my audience? Would they be using it? I'd probably go after Airbnb, actually, because I talk about them so much. They're in my book. I use them all the time. So that would be a more likely partner. But I really like the smaller independent firms. Like, we even sponsored Cognitive, or they were our sponsor, and we did a different arrangement with them because they were a startup, but it was like tea that really helps you with your mindset and clarity and focus, and I thought that was actually really cool given how many people have issues with that, and it doesn't matter whether you're traveling or you've got a business, it's quite relevant. So I like working with the smaller startups and the smaller businesses because we've all been there and we know what that's like, and I like independent companies or ones that maybe aren't so big but have a really, really cool service or product. So that's usually what I aim for, not necessarily the big name.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about last night about some sponsors and sponsorship groups like Midroll and things like that, and they require their podcasters to actually survey their audience and get really specific demographic data before sponsoring. Have you ever been asked for really specific data like that? And if so, how did you get it? And if not, how would you go about getting that data from your audience if you needed to?
Yeah, it's difficult actually because Libsyn, which is my host I use, they don't give you that much data. They give you fair amount, but even if you pay for extra, it's still not really specific. So that's often what I'll say back to the sponsors. I can't tell you all these, but here's all the stuff that we do know. Here's previous downloads of episodes around this topic, or for this sponsor, how many downloads we got, how many retweets we got, how many hits they got to their website. So I often use past sponsor data that we got given from them to kind of say, on average, our conversions are X, Y, Z. I'm not massively specific with that. I usually go for businesses that I think I have a good relationship with, and they don't ever seem to be hung up on all those facts. So maybe I'm picking the right companies. Maybe I just have a different style on how I approach them. But I think it's useful. The more metrics you can provide, or the more proof and credibility of conversions, the better. Definitely, as a business owner, I'd look for that. But often it's just about taking a chance sometimes and selling them on that, the why in the audience.
Okay, Charles and Joseph both had questions that kind of go together. So Charles wanted to know if sponsors have ever approached you. Either, I guess, they've heard other sponsors on your show and thought, hey, that sounds good for me. And then Joseph wanted to know if you've ever, would you ever bring on a sponsor that you didn't personally have experience with. So I guess that would, if you were approached by a sponsor, there's a good chance you wouldn't necessarily have used their product, but they might make a compelling pitch that they're good for your audience. What kind of, have you ever had that situation?
Great question, and I saw it pop up. Actually, I have a sponsor that's just approached us right now. That is a cloud solution, kind of, that's what that cloud solution. So rather than Dropbox or something like that, it's an all-in-one cloud solution that you can have on your laptop. So it does really appeal, because I looked into the service and it looks quite cool, and it's related to what I talk about all the time, an office in the cloud. But I would want to test out their service probably first, because there's a lot of those sort of systems out there, and one is not necessarily better than the other. So they would be an example of that's a good fit. I might promote them before having used them, but I'd want to better understand the product first. And generally, I'd ask somebody like that, could you give me a trial account for a week so I can just see how it works and play around with it? And then at least I'm talking from a better place. Like, I can honestly say I haven't used them very much, but when I was playing around, I liked their interface, or this was really seamless, or this was quick, and then you can talk about it from more experience.
Charles wanted to know a little bit more. I know you said some of your sponsors, they give you data on their conversions, and then you could use that information for new sponsors and let them know kind of how your audience is converting. What does that data look like? What is that information they provide you?
Often it's just like during the space of that sponsorship period from X to Z, you sent this many hundreds of visitors, and of those visitors, this many converted. That's generally what they track on their end as well. And sometimes they don't generally tell you the amount, but you can kind of figure it out if that was the plan that they were selling, or the average cost of the new user sign-up.
Okay, now I have a question that's somewhat off topic, but it's something we were talking about. We've been talking about the past 2 nights, really, and that's kind of on Facebook, and you mentioned social sharing of some of your sponsors just naturally and organically. And we were talking about Facebook pages versus Facebook groups. Let's get your opinion on the Facebook pages versus groups. What do you find more valuable? What are you using these days more?
Yeah, Facebook. Gotta love and hate it. My Facebook page is perfect for promoting posts. That's pretty much what I use it for now. The engagement on it's dropped off so much since Facebook changed their policies. It's frustrating, because it used to be a really cool community. So it is a good place where I will post up photos and blog posts and podcasts, and then once they're up, we'll often use a way of doing a Facebook advert to actually bring more attention to that. Outside of that, I really love Facebook groups. So the blog challenge I'm running right now, my Freedom Plan program, groups are where it's at. There's so much more engagement on there. There's so much more link sharing, and it's a much easier place to be able to tag people and actually create a community. So I think groups are the way to go. I also think Google Plus communities are really cool as well. LinkedIn groups, the same way it works. It's more private, it's more exclusive. You have direct access to people. You can email the whole group at one time. Whereas pages just kind of, to me, seem like just a web static page these days where you pay to play.
So what's your secret? This is something we were talking about. The groups, they're very, I don't know what you call it, very susceptible to spam posts and people just coming in there and just destroying the group. And if you let that go for too long, everyone is going to leave the group. So do you have any tips for how to moderate it other than just mass deleting these people whenever they post junk in there?
I am really lucky in that I don't have too much of that. Hopefully that's the kind of people I attract. But I do often in my Facebook group banner, I do say the rules of the group. So it'll be like only share useful information, no selling, no spamming. So there's generally some very strong guidelines in there. And even in my club, the other day I kind of called somebody out privately. We don't do that in here, and that's why I deleted your post for you. And they're like, oh, sorry, I just didn't know. So I'm pretty lucky. Like, I've got this group right now which has got hundreds, and it's quite hard to maintain and keep up with. But in general, so far, everybody's focused on the blog challenge, not selling themselves. And I do have a virtual assistant who jumps in and helps. So between us, we kind of monitor that. And I generally find if you make a few people ambassadors of that group, they tend to get in there and save the day. So luckily, not too many spammers, but outside of just being really clear on the rules and reminding people of that, I guess I often make people join my groups, like they have to request to join because there's a purpose for them. If they're open, then it's a little bit harder to control. And it's the nature of, unfortunately, social groups and communities. There's always going to be people in there self-promoting and trying to spam.
Nature of the beast. Now, we do have a few more questions on sponsorships. Charles wants to know what your ideal time frame, or maybe what you've seen converts the best in convincing sponsors to come on board, in terms of, do you build them quarterly? Do they agree to monthly agreements? What have you found most successful?
Yeah, I think if they're a little bit more reticent about joining up, I will definitely say, look, let's trial it out for a month and kind of give them a per episode amount, but that is more of a discount if it's over a month. So I try not to go with one-off episodes because I don't really find they're useful for anybody. Plus there's that extra time of putting in the logos and the write-up and the banners. And then from there you can agree on an extension. So that seems to go pretty well. Like, a month is not too long of a commitment for people. It's 4 episodes. It gives them enough time to kind of see what conversion rates are like. And then I think it's good for both of you, because if you find that it's not working out, or you don't feel comfortable about it, or it's just not the right fit, you're not then locked in for 6 months. So honestly, it depends on your audience. It depends on your goals with the sponsorship. But I would say 2 weeks to 4 weeks is a good enough time to get some traction and understanding of how it's working out.
Yeah, and I think the one concern that Charles kind of expressed here was that he tells his sponsors that typically it takes a little while to see these conversions, and I know that's a very I guess a very old school rule that with direct marketing and back to the days of postcards and letters in the mail, that it's like the 12th or 13th time you actually make a connection with someone before they actually do something about it. But if you're signing these short-term deals, you might not ever get to that point where your audience starts acting on it, becomes familiar with what it is. Do you ever have that conversation with sponsors when you're trying to pitch longer-term commitments?
I guess I have done in the past, but that's a great point, Charles. I mean, I think most of them kind of know that. I do try and emphasize that the longer term it is, the more likely their name's going to get heard. There's going to be good brand representation. It allows us time in the community and social media to talk about them more, and that all benefits their sort of long-term agreement. So I think they know that, but it's good to reiterate it for sure. And if you can, once again, come back to proof, like, the sponsor was with us for 3 months and they saw this incredible curve, whereas the sponsor did it for a month and we know they were just starting to grow, but they then renewed and it helped them out. So anything you can do to build the story and show proof and credibility is going to help.
Now, Christian has a good question here. He has a question about bartering. Have you ever, or would you ever consider trading products or services instead of cash for sponsorships?
Yeah, I actually did that with Regis. So Regis offered me up a 6-month option to be a member of their lounges and to be able to co-work around the world, which was a pretty decent amount for that membership. And I said, sure, I'll try it out for 6 months, use it, feedback on it, and in return you'll get the monthly podcast sponsorship, which actually didn't last the whole 6 months. It was for like the same value that the sponsorship would have been. Versus their membership. So that was really cool, because I only just finished up with that membership recently, and I'm probably going to renew or work out another deal with them because I really enjoyed it. So that made sense to me because it was a good win-win situation.
Joseph has a question, and maybe it takes this a little further. Have you ever offered like a free trial sponsorship to sponsors, and saying, hey, just come, I'll give you some free ad space on the show basically, and if it converts well, then maybe you'll want to pay me for those conversions later on? No.
I'm pretty specific about that. I've worked hard to build my audience and my community, and I think at the end of the day, if people can't afford to sort of invest and trust in you and vice versa, and you're doing them the service of putting them out to your community with no necessary return on investment, I'd prefer to work with people who are okay with doing that from the beginning. But that's just the way I am.
And even though they pay you, he wants to know, if they pay you, is there ever an affiliate commission as well? So if you're advertising a product or service, is there ever like 2 components to the payment structure?
sometimes, so I tried that the other day with HostGator, and they're like, well, it's not really fair if we're spending the sponsor amount with you to then use your affiliate link and make even more. And I was like, absolutely, but I just asked because I already am an affiliate. So I was just asking. So that's the response that they gave me. Others might be open to it, but I think they had a really fair point. It's kind of paying out on two fronts, which is not necessarily fair for them.
Now, and I'm aware of some sponsors who they pay some of the bigger name podcasters, some of the higher profile podcasts to have sponsorship space, but they also let people say they're sponsored by the show, but really it's just an affiliate commission. Do you have thoughts on that, where it's only the affiliate commission is what you're advertising for?
Well, that's what I was just thinking when you asked that question. I mean, rather than go out and try and get their sponsorship, just have them as a sponsor on your show and get the affiliate commission from it. I mean, that would be something that I do and have considered doing for all the tools and the products that I love, like lead pages. I'm always talking about them and referring them, and they give out good affiliate commissions. So there's no reason why I couldn't just talk about them more on my podcast and not actually go after them as a sponsor or say it's sponsored by, but just have a tool of the week or a product of the week, for example. So you can definitely do that on your own, especially if you've started seeing good conversions.
Very cool. Now we have time for one more question, and it's a good one. It's a doozy, and it goes back to something you mentioned. Charles says, Natalie, you said never take no for an answer, or at least the first no. Don't take no if you ask. And one of the things he's gotten before is we don't sponsor podcasts right now. So what is that magic Natalie pitch to the companies who don't sponsor podcasts, but you know that this is a good space for them?
That's an interesting one, huh? I'd love to answer that question, because what I would normally do is I'd actually get on the phone with them and I'd say, okay, what are you spending right now on your advertising elsewhere, and how is that working out for you, and what's the conversion? Because you'll often find that they're probably throwing tens of thousands at traditional advertising and not getting any reach. And I would say, look, give me 1 month to disprove that and show you that you could spend, 1/5 of the cost and get five times more reach. If you can back that up. But I would say you could also point out other major sponsors who have switched to the podcast advertising model, like Onnit.com. They only went after podcast sponsorships when they started, and they grew their business tremendously through reaching out to key influencers and tapping into their audience and going that way. So you could, especially if they're in a related industry, you could say, here are some sponsors of other big name podcasts or other podcasts, and this is how successful they've been. Often podcasters will put out about the reach or the results they've had. So I would say you're trying to convince them to change their behavior, but if it's worth it for a long-term thing, then you can just come up with some really good case studies and proof of evidence, and it might just sway them.
Very cool. Great answer, Natalie. Great presentation all night. Any closing words on this topic before we sign off for the evening?
I will just actually want to say one thing, and I'm happy for people to steal this idea if they want, but what about sponsoring yourself? Rather than actually going after sponsors, what about getting your listeners and your audience to actually sponsor you back? Sponsor a coffee, sponsor a night out, sponsor a hotel room, whatever it may be. There's a cool models that I've seen for blogs and things like that I think could start being transferred to the podcast world. And it's something I'm seriously considering. Like, if you like this episode, if you're enjoying this podcast, come across to this URL and leave a small donation, and all gratefully received, and it will go towards bettering the podcast, bringing on better guests, getting better recordings, etc., etc. I think that could be a really cool model that people can try out. It's the kind of crowdfunding, community-based, support-based. So if you're not having much luck with sponsors, that might be a way to go.
Yeah, and that's not just a crowdfunding thing, but like NPR, anyone who listens to the National Public Radio or This American Life type things, that's what a lot of them do. Hey, it's campaign drive time or something like that. So I don't think that's a foreign concept. I think some, maybe some listeners would even be more accepting of that than sponsors. Just saying, hey, it takes money to put this on. Consider a $5 donation here or there. So I think that's something that listeners might be accepting of, and that obviously doesn't require pitching sponsors or anything like that. And as long as you feel like you're not going to alienate any of your listeners or run them off by doing that, then I think that's worth a try. So Natalie, let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you, how they can get in touch with you, and any additional questions. We're going to have a lot of people watching this recorded webinar this time, since we had the technical difficulty. So where can people go to thank you and ask you any questions?
I would love for them to hit me up on Twitter, so at Natalie Sisson. If there's a hashtag for this event, then if you put that in, then I'll search for you and find you. So any questions you can pop in there. Otherwise, come across the suitcaseentrepreneur.com and you'll find my podcast there, but also my other social media profiles, and hopefully find some juicy content and good stuff on there. But those would be the best places. And then I'm also facebook.com/suitcaseentrepreneur if they want to come and hang out on my page and say hello.
Very cool. Thank you, Natalie. And for those of us, those watching us live, tomorrow night we've got automation and automation tools for podcasters with Christian Sisson. He's in the chat room now, and he'll be leading that class tomorrow. And then we've got creative interview strategies for growing your network with Christina Cantors from across the pond as well. So we've definitely got the international flair on this conference, and we're happy all of you followed us over here to the Google Hangouts. And we'll see everyone tomorrow. Thanks for joining us again, Natalie.
Thanks, guys.